just to give you an update, the Israeli army is now confirming what CNN reported a little while ago, that there are at least 900 dead in these Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel. Many of the dead, almost 300 of those dead, were attending a music festival. There has been footage from some of the cars parked nearby, dash cam footage showing these armed men grabbing people at the music festival and pulling them away. Spencer, it doesn't feel like this has anything to do with policy or intellectual enlightenment. This seems to me just pure emotional gut reaction here. What did you think as you watched this unfold over the weekend? What was going through your mind?
Yeah, I agree. I think that has to be your first reaction. It has to hit you physically in your heart and your gut if you're at all connected to your feelings. And, that's really where morality originates. So just the horror and the suffering of innocent people being used as tools, basically to create shocking images in the media, which is essentially how terrorism works, is just horrifying. I agree. That's where one can't help but start.
I'm a little confused. I understand that Hamas is viewed by some of the world, at least, as a terrorist organization, and yet they also are more than that. They are political as well, obviously running candidates in the last elections in Gaza and beating out the more moderate Palestinian authority that usually took many of those positions of power. What does that mean? Should we, when that election happened, and I think in 2006, should we have noted a change in the winds at that time?
Yes, and I actually think that what we're seeing now actually is related to what's happening across the world, including in the United States. Including the moral dimension of this and the difficulty we now have talking about moral issues without getting confused about the difference, for example, between terrorism and politics. But the rise of extremist organizations like Hamas that exploit the mass media to conduct terror there's always been people committing atrocities throughout human history, but the rise of mass media enabled terrorism, as well as totalitarianism. So those are sort of recent phenomena, and along with mechanized weaponry as well, and the ability for anybody to create bombs or easily get hold of automatic weapons and that sort of thing. These are all modern phenomena, but also the rise of extremism all around. Across the world. If you step back and look at the rise of hateful nationalism and the exploitation of that extreme hate-filled nationalism by cynical leaders, we see that happening in China, here in the United States, of course, with Trump and his imitators, in Russia, with the Brexit crowd in England, many of whom are fairly closely tied with Russia, as are lots of these nationalist extremists. You see it in Hungary, Turkey, Brazil, and in Israel. And I want to be careful not to engage in any moral relativism here. I have very serious problems, as many people do, with the Netanyahu government. I think that they are morally bankrupt in many ways and extremely dangerous, a dangerous threat to democracy.
I've described him as Israel's version of a Trumpish sort of leader.
Yeah.
I mean, this new government
exactly
he's put together, he picked the farthest of the far right to join his government. I mean, they were the ones trying to basically disempower the courts put the courts at the power of political parties and politicians. And there have been protests, huge protests on a daily basis. So I can see why supposedly, obviously Netanyahu went on television and said, we've got to be unified. We have to form a unity government the way we did during the war in the 1960s. This is our survival is at stake. And some of the people who have opposed him say, well, we will join you in forming a government, but it won't be without conditions. Basically, they don't trust the guy. They don't trust the guy not to use this situation to solidify and consolidate his own personal power. I mean, that speaks volumes.
Yeah, and this gets back to where I was kind of looping around via, a quick trip around the world of ethnic nationalist hatred. You mentioned the success of Hamas in the elections against the Palestinian Authority. And this also replicates what's happening because you have these people like Hamas who promise a moral crusade. They promise to fill a moral vacuum. And the Palestinian Authority is notoriously corrupt. Their leader was supposed to serve in office for 4 years, and that was 19 years ago. And so they have very little political support among Palestinians. And Hamas, a lot of these groups, comes in with this, we're on a mission from God to rescue the people kind of message. And they're filling a moral vacuum. They're filling it with something hateful. But there is that moral vacuum. And in Israel, I think as some in Israel have lost faith in the possibility of a two-state solution, for example, and as the seemingly intractable situation there has dragged on for so many decades, some of them have turned towards the messages of the most extreme right-wing, vicious, and racist, just horrible elements of the extreme right in Israel, like this guy Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's a devotee of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who many people might not remember, but he refers to Arabs as dogs and essentially says all of biblical Israel has to be reclaimed for the Jews, and the Arabs need to sit down like obedient dogs or leave. And in a way, people like Netanyahu and people like that guy and people like Hamas need each other.
Really?
They're partners. Yeah, because they're exploiting. They claim to be protecting the people they serve, and they're just exploiting them. Hamas is not pursuing a solution. In fact, if you look at the alignment of interests, which is always a good place to start, like who benefits from this current situation? How do the interests align? Why isn't this problem being solved? It's because some people benefit from this problem not being solved. And terrorist organizations like Hamas exploit suffering people who are legitimately suffering. The Palestinians have legitimate, very serious grievances going back a long time. But they've been exploited by a series of extremist organizations. It used to be the PLO under Yasser Arafat conducting terrorist activities. And now it's Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and these people. They have no interest in solving the problem. And in fact, if the problem were solved, they would basically lose their jobs. And, I think the not insignificant population of outright sadists among them would lose the opportunity to indulge in this horrendous cruelty that they probably get a fair amount of pleasure from. And meanwhile, innocent Palestinians go on suffering year after year, decade after decade. And of course, Israel bears responsibility in this, but so do this sequence of terrorists launching attacks against Israel, not to try to come to some kind of just settlement for Palestinians, but because basically that's their business. That's their business model. And so the tragedy of this sort of situation is that helps lead to governments like the government of Netanyahu, led, as you say, I think, by somebody who's just completely self-seeking the way Trump is. Not an extremist, except his extreme self-interest. But it leads to the rise of an authoritarian, anti-democratic government like Netanyahu's. And it serves Netanyahu's interests, and it serves the interests of the extremists in his government, and it serves the interests of Hamas and the other terrorists, and the terrorist-enabling government of Iran. And the raw material being processed in this industry of horror is the lives of innocent people, including the lives of innocent Palestinians.
But the leaders of these organizations will all tell you what they want is peace. They just want it to be a just peace.
Yeah, and this is an obscenity in my view. And this is part of the problem here is it's very easy to get confused when you're trying to sort through the moral issues here, partly, in my view, because we don't learn how to think morally in school or in our culture because we decided that in the interests of freedom of religion and non-imposition of any one religion on the whole population, an unanticipated consequence is that talking about moral questions is kind of off limits in public life much of the time for fear of offending somebody or appearing to look like you're recommending one moral system over another. But we have to be able to talk about moral questions. And so the confusion over terrorism, for example, is a case in point where a lot of this doesn't need to be that confusing. Like you often hear people say, for example, well, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And you'll hear people who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause in the next breath say, well, Israel basically should have expected some kind of reaction like this because of the occupation going back 56 years. But there's such an elementary confusion of moral categories there, I think. Terrorism is the deliberate targeting of non-combatants to achieve political ends. It's and deliberately targeting civilians, innocent civilians, in the most terrifying way possible. And that is not your only choice if you feel that you're fighting a just cause. If you can be, let's take the most sympathetic view towards the Palestinians and the most unsympathetic view towards Israel for a moment, just to explore this as a moral question. Terrorism is not your only option in that case. As not only more moral, but more effective leaders of social movements have shown, especially since the 20th century, but going back actually millennia, if you want to go back to people like the Buddha, for example, or many people would point to Jesus, or many people would point to Muhammad. But Gandhi or Martin Luther King proved the power, not just the moral righteousness, but the power of nonviolent resistance. Mm-hmm. And especially, that won't work in every situation. If you're working with, a totalitarian regime that cares nothing for moral questions and has absolute control of the media. Well, I was going to ask you, is it possible that, especially with Gandhi, because they were basically resisting against the British, and while the British certainly can be very, very violent, there still is this whole idea of honor that coexists and that passive resistance, even though it did provoke some violence, it seemed to me that sort of an approach would be more effective with the British than, say, it would be with the Russians. Right. So, this is one of the things that drives me nuts about Cornel West, for example, as a third-party candidate, aside from the risk of what third-party candidates competing with the Democratic candidate could do, pose under our current situation. But Cornel West, if you ask him how he would resolve the Ukraine conflict, his answer amounts to, well, I would get everybody in a room to sit down and talk, and I'd point out to Putin that he's harming people, as if that's a surprise to Putin. But I think your point is a good one. Britain committed, they colonized India. It's a huge crime in itself, and then they drained it of resources, not nearly as often as a country like Putin's Russia would, but they resorted to political violence, including the horrendous Amritsar massacre. But Britain had a set of values it claimed to uphold. Mm-hmm. And Gandhi forced them to confront the difference between what they claimed were their values and what their behavior was. And the British people wanted to believe in those values, and ultimately, it took a long time, but it didn't take longer than the Palestinian-Israeli conflict's been going on. It took a long time, and the government of Britain finally had to acknowledge that this was unsustainable, and, in large part because of pressure from their own people who did not want to think about themselves this way. And they finally, they moderated the behavior and then made a plan to back out of India, which they did. And same with Martin Luther King. And, and you'll still hear people, especially on the left, of people who think that in some circles, they think Martin Luther King was too weak, and too passive and should have been more revolutionary and should have accepted that the only alternative was violence. But, I reject that on moral grounds, but it also just doesn't work as well as has been shown over and over again. Martin Luther King was enormously effective, and the people recommending violence have faded from history and had very little impact.
And, too, if your group resorts to violence, it is more it's easier to discount your group. Oh, they're just a bunch of violent people.
Yeah.
Whereas when somebody uses this positive, peaceful protest, you have to deal with it on a different level. You can't dismiss it so easily.
Exactly. And this is part of the suffering visited upon the Palestinian people. This sequence of terrorists who have been claiming to represent them going back decades now, not just immorally, but stupidly, make the rest of the world associate the Palestinian cause with terrorism. And so you have to work really hard to separate the just claims of the Palestinians from the terroristic strategies that are pursued, supposedly on their behalf. And it's I'm sure has delayed justice for the Palestinians. And as I say, I don't believe that the people perpetrating this terroristic violence have any interest actually in a solution, because it would put them out of business.
I don't know if we have time before the break. One of the things that I wanted to address with you, so we have, maybe 3 minutes to talk about this, but to at least start the discussion. That was one of the things that I kept thinking about. What does Hamas want to gain with this? I mean, even the people who've planned this and executed all these different attacks, they know that they do not have the military might or the military will that Israel has. They know that the United States and other countries are not going to come to their aid. They're going to come to the aid of Israel. I mean, do you think this is just terrorism for terrorism's sake? Do you think they really think that somehow this is going to drive all the Israelis out of the Gaza Strip and they're now going to have their own little fiefdom? I don't understand the big picture. Sure, short term, we're going to give them a black eye. We're going to show them how vulnerable they can be. But long-term goal doesn't seem to make sense with this kind of an action. What do you think that they are trying to gain with what they are doing?
Yeah, well, I think that the end game for them probably looks something like the end game for the Taliban, which would be to wait out the power you're fighting, like the Taliban did, and to consider the lives of innocent people to be a really cheap natural resource that you don't mind spending. It's like water. You'll waste it if you're thinking like that, and so you'll wait as long as it takes. And the end game is not a just solution for those people. You're just using those people. The end game is you're in charge of a piece of territory, and so you establish an authoritarian regime with you in charge, like the Iranian mullahs, for example. Who I think are just utterly reprehensible. Again, there was a just cause in Iran, going back to the coup against a democratically elected government that Britain and the United States and oil companies didn't like way back. But the Iranian mullahs are just awful. And the only people who benefit from that regime are the Iranian mullahs. So I think that's probably the end game, is they'll just wait as long as it takes. And essentially, from their point of view, they're not paying the cost. It's innocent people who are paying the cost. And they've shown repeatedly, not only do they not care about the fates of innocent people, but they see them as a natural resource because they exploit them to produce horrifying videos. You know, when Israel does strike back, like Israel is striking back so forcefully now, and with obviously there's going to be unavoidable, terrible costs among civilians in Gaza because of this. Hamas, that's an opportunity for them. They get to drag the bodies of dead Palestinian civilians through the streets, and it's the video is what's valuable to them, not the lives of those people who just died.
Okay. I still don't feel like I grasp a viable end game here. Hamas has already run candidates for office and been elected in Gaza. And you would think that they could build on that sort of political power to reach their ends.
That would require them to actually deliver services to the people, right? To do the boring work of running an efficient government that delivers services. But, you know, where's the realistic plan for economic development in Gaza, for example? Now, they'll, like a gang, you know, they'll help out families who lose family members in Israeli army attacks, for example, or bombings. They'll be seen to be passing around aid the same way the mafia did, or the same way any gang does when it's occupying a neighborhood.
So set the building on fire and then line up with the fire brigade to help all the neighbors put it out.
Yeah, they're the ones. I mean, you know, these are very hard moral issues, including the Israeli response poses very hard moral issues. But Hamas is all too happy to put all its facilities right in the middle of one of the most densely populated areas in the world, Gaza, and knowing that they're using innocent civilians as shields, and knowing that when they provoke Israel, there is going to be a military response that's going to unavoidably kill many of those people Hamas is sheltering among. I mean, that in itself is a war crime. So, yeah, I don't think they have any interest in the fact that they won an election, which would normally mean that now they have a job of delivering services and helping with the just and equitable development of the territory they're ruling. They're just going to continue to exploit it for their own ends, while telling themselves, no doubt, that they're on some kind of holy mission. But people have always done that and done the most atrocious things in the name of whatever God they claim is on their side.
Yeah. Spencer, we need to take a break. I'm talking to Spencer Critchley. His podcast is Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. His book is Patriots of Two Nations. We'll be right back after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Spencer Critchley, the author of Patriots of Two Nations and host of the podcast Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. He and I have been talking about the unfolding war between Israel and Hamas, centering on Gaza, a tiny strip of land along the Mediterranean. The Israeli army is now reporting 900 dead. There are hundreds who have been taken hostage. Hamas apparently saying that if Israel lands or brings ground troops into Gaza, that the hostages will all be executed. Women, children, elderly, whole families taken hostage. We've been talking about what Hamas has to gain, or what the whole point is here. I was just watching during the break, Spencer. The United States is moving ships into the Mediterranean Sea. We are increasing our military materials support for Israel. Spencer, does this have the makings of the beginning of a world war? I mean, we've all been keeping our eye on Ukraine, and we've been worried that Russia would attack a NATO nation, and where would that leave the world? And while we were worrying about that, now we have another war to pay attention to, one that the whole world is watching right now. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Well, Boy, I certainly hope not, but I think without being an alarmist, that has to be considered to be a risk, whether it's a full-on World War III or it's a more regional conflict that, as we've seen, even just a regional conflict can be just so enormously destructive. When you consider that Iran undoubtedly has some role in what Hamas just did, it's unclear so far exactly what. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that it was a direct and active role. Others are disputing that, and I don't think we have enough evidence yet, unless the Wall Street Journal is really confident in their sources. Then, there's the alliance between Russia and Iran where they need each other. And it's part of this global trend that you and I often talk about, usually mostly in the context of what's happening here in the United States, but what's happening here in the United States is also happening globally. And it really is, in many ways, a breakdown of the post-World War II order, which, you often hear phrases like that if you're watching, talk shows about international politics. You'll hear these phrases like the rules-based international order or the post-war global order. And that sounds like jargon, and, it is, but it has deep meaning. And the alternative to the rules-based international order or the post-World War II order is all of previous human history, which was just basically one war after another when, every now and then broken up by terrible famines and plagues. Europe was at war for as long as there was a Europe, until World War II basically ended. And the emergence from World War II of bodies like the United Nations, as feckless as it often seems, and the other international organizations and international agreements on human rights and the Geneva Convention on the Conduct of War, as often as these things are violated, what there was before was so much worse and would be so much worse now because of the machinery of death we have now that, humanity had never seen before. So the risks here are enormous. Nobody, no matter how smart they are or think they are, no matter how much intelligence they have at their fingertips, can possibly predict how events will unfold in a world where, of course, much of what unfolds only happens because of an infinite number of other things that were unpredictable from one moment to the next. Like this attack over the weekend. Nobody saw it coming. We don't know what the next thing is that nobody will see
considering
coming.
That the Israeli security apparatus and their intelligence apparatus is viewed as one of, if not the best in the world. I've been reading some articles today, like how did this happen right under their nose? And this vaunted security apparatus missed apparently any and all signs. Yeah,
and a lot of this we have to recognize is speculative, of course, at this stage, but some of the speculation is that Netanyahu, by going along with the right-wing extremists in his government and encouraging the settlements in the West Bank, and the often awful behavior by the settlers in the West Bank, those settlers now have to be protected by the Israel Defense Force. So, some of the speculation is that a lot of military resources were distracted protecting this illegal settlement opportunity in the West Bank.
Could this, even if this is resolved in a positive way, as positive as it can be for Israel, could this be the beginning of Netanyahu's undoing? Do you think the Israeli people are going to take a step back and say, you know what, our military was diverted because of your policies? People in Palestine were feeling like they didn't have any recourse because of your policies. Could this be the beginning of the end for him politically?
Well, I sure hope so. I think the alternative is also very likely, though, because when you get these cycles of violence and fear and anger and resentment and hatred, people tend to become more militaristic, and to demonize the other side even more. And you can see these These blood feuds have, again, throughout most of human history, they've gone on for generations. There are parts of the world where people are still fighting over things that happened centuries ago. They still hate each other over things that happened centuries ago. So there is a risk of that. And again, this gets me back to the value of liberal democracy, the rules-based order, all of these things we take for granted. If nothing else, the alternative to these things is violence, which I think those of us who have been living in relative comfort and safety in the United States and similar countries all these years take that for granted because we've never had to deal with it. We haven't, grown up in places like Central or Eastern Europe or Russia or other places that have suffered from violence and totalitarian regimes and all of the horrors of the alternatives to liberal democracy and the rules-based order. But the alternative to democracy and liberalism writ large, the system that our democracy runs on, is violence. And this is what's at risk here in this kind of situation with these deliberate provocateurs like Hamas and like the extremists in the Netanyahu government who would love to have a war, I'm sure, so that they can finally expel or exterminate the Arabs, basically. That's the risk. That's the larger risk, is whether we have a world war or not, is the breakdown of the norms that, for all the terrible things that have happened since World War II, have kept the world more peaceful than it had ever been in previous history, as hard as that is to imagine. What we can complain all we like about the way it's been, but it's better than it ever was before.
I'm speaking to Spencer Critchley, author of Patriots of Two Nations. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, speaking of political disarray and moral ambiguity, when Spencer and I come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the Republican Party as it exists, at least in the House of Representatives right now. We'll be back after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
I'm joined by Spencer Critchley. He hosts a podcast called Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. It doesn't seem to be the headline story that I thought it would be today, but the dysfunction and the disarray in Congress right now with the Republicans, Tommy Tuberville holding up military promotions, Ron Johnson, one of the people holding up an appointment of an official Israeli ambassador from the United States. And, by the way, there's no Speaker of the House, and the feeling is beginning to be that neither Steve Scalise nor Jim Jordan are going to have the votes to take on that role. Spencer, address our own disarray, if you will. Yeah.
Well, maybe I look for connections to a fault, but I think this relates to what we were talking about just the absence of a clear moral discussion in the Israeli situation, and similarly here at home with the Republicans in Congress and the Republican Party generally. You still often hear people describe support for Trump and Trumpism, or these people like Matt Gaetz or Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene, in terms of misinformation. Even the attack on the Capitol on January 6th of 2021 is described as people who were misinformed. And it's as if there's a big blind spot to the moral dimension, because you don't just attack the Capitol because you were misinformed. That's a moral decision to do something immoral. And you don't continue to support the Republican Party when it's led by somebody who is literally trying to overthrow democracy and who has been shown over and over again to be a criminal. Just because you're misinformed, because you have to choose to be that misinformed. And that's a moral choice that you're making. And I think ultimately that's, just like internationally, here at home, we have to recover what, people often smile at Joe Biden when he talks like this, but I think he's exactly right when he talks about restoring the soul of democracy. It can sound sentimental, but it sounds sentimental, I think, because we're so alienated from talking about morality. Democracy has to have a moral center. It can't just be a bureaucratic system for collecting taxes and delivering services. People are hungry for a sense of purpose in their lives, and part of that sense of purpose has to be, why do we live together in a community or a nation? Why are we doing this? And it's not just a business arrangement, although we often treat it that way. It's not just a contest of competing interests where we're all scrambling over how the tax money is going to be spent, for example. There has to be some moral core to why do we have a democracy as opposed to an authoritarian system. And how is it that we find ourselves now where there are millions of Americans who say they would prefer an authoritarian system, or who don't think, as Yasha Monk has famously reported over the past few years, conducting polling, that there are many people, including many young Americans, who don't think democracy is particularly important as a form of government. And that's a moral crisis. And I think that the Republicans in Congress are acting out the consequences of a moral vacuum right before our eyes, with people who operate only in a free market of pure self-interest, pure political self-interest, and who are just otherwise completely unserious people with apparently no sense of responsibility to fulfill their oaths of office. I think that's first of all a moral crisis that we're witnessing.
How do you see the situation in Congress resolving, or maybe not resolving, in the near and mid future?
Well, I think that extrapolating from what we've seen so far with the politics of MAGA is that it usually is a loser. So you can only, bet according to odds. We obviously can't know for sure. But I think that the odds are Republicans will suffer again in the upcoming elections, including the presidential election. I think that there are enough people in the middle who make so much difference as swing voters, who see what's going on for what it is and are disgusted by it. No matter what the polls look like now, Trump will lose, assuming he's still the nominee. What about these third-party candidates?
Today, again, another news item that I didn't bother with. Robert Kennedy has made the big announcement that he's not going to run as a Democrat. He's going to run as an independent. Yay! Like anybody seriously cares, except, of course, for his poor family that once again felt the need to put out a statement. The decision of our brother Bobby to run as a third-party candidate against Joe Biden is dangerous to our country. Bobby might share the same name as our father, but he doesn't share the same values, vision, or judgment. Today's announcement is deeply saddening for us. We denounce his candidacy and believe it to be perilous for our country. Oof.
Wow, good for them. I agree. And it's kind of like Paul Gosar's, I think it was, Brothers and Sisters, who said under no circumstances should anybody ever vote for this guy, for our brother, basically. I think it was Gosar.
Well, there have been a number of Republicans whose families have repudiated them.
Yeah. Again, and this is why I'm so deeply concerned. You and I keep promising we're going to talk about something a little happier, and unfortunately,
today is not that day. I don't think today is that day.
This is definitely not that day. But I think in the short term that the Trumpists are going to lose. RFK Jr. is going to lose.
But could an RFK Jr.
be more or less okay?
Could a no labels candidate? Those seem to be designed specifically to draw votes. Well, actually, there's some speculation that Kennedy is such a whack job he might actually draw more votes from Trump than from Biden. That's what supposedly Donald Trump's getting ready to start attacking him. But I agree with you that there's more sane people than there are insane people. But if there's a number of people drawn off by third-party candidates, that's when I worry, because of that stupid electoral college.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is the trouble is that although I think we'll probably be okay, the trouble is just getting by the skin of our teeth is still a crisis. There's no way any of this should be close.
Yeah, exactly.
That gets back to this moral vacuum and this just sort of lack of seriousness. I mean, Bobby Kennedy, there's something wrong with him, and he's not a serious candidate. All this vaccine conspiracy stuff and all this crazy veering all over the ideological spectrum and his blatant lying and then denying he said something that's on videotape,
Yeah.
And the idea, this is where voters come in, because voters, so many seem to be so disengaged from their responsibilities, their minimal responsibilities as citizens, to be basically well-informed. There's not much that's demanded of you as a citizen in an advanced democracy, right? But you do have a responsibility to vote, and you have a responsibility to cast an informed vote. And yet, I think too many voters have instead of being citizens, they're more like consumers. And they'll say things like, well, I've had it with the Democrats and Republicans. They're all crooks. And therefore I'm going to vote for RFK. And, based on essentially maybe 5 minutes of thought about what's going on here. And this is part of the crisis we find ourselves in. It's what I was saying about the Trumpists, storming the Capitol or saying that they would vote for Trump yet again. That is not a misinformation problem. That's a failure of your moral responsibility. There's this concept in philosophy of epistemological responsibility, just meaning you kind of have a responsibility not to be an idiot. You don't. Nobody should blame you if you didn't win the genetic lottery in terms of your basic intelligence. We should never, judge people because they happen to be on the lower end of the IQ scale. Through obviously no fault of their own, and there's no shame in that, just like there's no shame in being a lousy athlete or not being able to paint, or sing. It's all essentially a genetic crapshoot. You shouldn't take credit for it if you're smart, and you shouldn't blame anybody for not being smart. But it's not just an intelligence thing. If being unintelligent led you to make a moral decision. Sometimes it's a basic kindness. It's just
exactly.
Basic,
that's one thing that I don't understand of people who are ardent Trump supporters. The man is not kind. He is not kind. I would like kindness.
He's a terrible person. No, he invites you to indulge whatever sadistic impulses you have in you, and if you accept that invitation, that's your fault. If people say, well, these people are just dumb, first of all, they're not all dumb. A lot of them are highly intelligent, accomplished people who've made the cynical decision to support him, even though they know what he is. But other people who are being fooled by him, at this stage, they're choosing to be fooled by him. Because as you say, it's clear. Anybody can see when somebody is cruel. If it were just a matter of intellect, then developmentally disabled people would be terrible, cruel people.
Yeah.
But that is not true, is it?
No.
You very often find people who clearly intellectually are limited, are very often very sweet, kind people, and they respond to immoral behavior, cruel, vicious, dishonest behavior the same way anybody would. And they prefer kindness and honesty and, moral behavior. So once again, I think that this is the scale of this crisis is not something that's going to be solved in a few election cycles. If we are going to have to, we are being forced to face the consequences of our inattention to these issues, whether we want to or not. And how painful that experience is going to be up to us. Ultimately, I think the Greeks had it right, when they had the intuition very early on that character is destiny. This is why tragic figures always, their downfall is always the result of some flaw within them, right? The fatal tragic flaw. And I think that societies suffer the same fate too until they finally achieve some self-awareness. Now, that can happen, and it's happened in the worst cases in history, like with Germany, for example.
Why didn't it already happen? We experienced 4 years of Donald Trump at his homophobic, misogynistic, racist, uninformed best. And why didn't we learn that lesson then?
It's going to take as long as it's going to take, but I think we're going to be forced to learn it. There's a great book by a philosopher named Susan Neiman, who I interviewed for my podcast, called Learning from the Germans, which I highly recommend. And she talks about the process that Germany went through after World War II, and it took a long time and was very painful, and it's still going on, to just simply face honestly the fact that most Germans were enthusiastic supporters of Hitler. And almost none of them wanted to face that, but ultimately their children and grandchildren forced everybody to start facing it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Spencer, I think we're going to have you back sooner rather than later, as maybe it's just because it's this horrible weekend and Monday, but I sort of feel like the world is unraveling around me, and I don't think I can face it by myself.
Yes, I know how you feel.
I used to just feel like it was a game of whack-a-mole, but, it's gone beyond that. Last week I was telling the audience that by the time my show started on Monday, I was ready to put my head down on the desk because I just felt like events were, I couldn't keep up. I just couldn't keep up. This was supposed to be my week of rest.
If I can say one hopeful thing today, and I know we're running out of time, but it's that it presents each of us an opportunity for our lives to be meaningful in this way, because each of us can speak within our own circles, and we can speak up for what we believe is right, and we can do it in a way that doesn't perpetuate more hatred. So even if you know somebody who's a Trump voter, for example, I think you need to be honest about the moral issues involved, just like if they were writing checks to the KKK. It's morally equivalent. You have to let them know this is not okay, but do it in a way where you're not expressing hatred for them, because you have to accept that humanity is like this. People make terrible decisions and get very lost, but the rest of us have to stand up for it in a way that does not perpetuate more hatred, more resentment, and ultimately more violence. And then that is a very meaningful thing to do. So I'd say let's turn it around at least to that extent and see this as an opportunity to add some meaning to our lives. Each of us can do that just amongst our own circles. And the ripple effects are very significant.
Make sure that there's meaning and stand up for what you believe in. Okay, let's wrap it up quick before we get back into the dark stuff.
Way.
Spencer Critchley, author of Patriots of Two Nations. His podcast, the one he just referenced that I think we all need to listen to, Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. We're going to take a break for news. We're going to be back with more right after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive.
Quite frankly, I get most of my news from you.
Joan Esposito.
Y'all ready for this?
On WCPT 820.